Hey, good evening, Erev Tov, guten Abend, or wherever you are joining us from. It may be earlier in the day. My name is Svenja Bethke. I'm associate professor at the University of Leicester and importantly on the advisory board of the Leo Baeck Institute. It is a great pleasure to open this evening's launch of Die Mosse-Frauen, Deutsch-Jüdische Lebensgeschichten, the Mosse Women, German Jewish Life Stories by Dr. Elisabeth Wagner. And this book was published in 2024 by the Wallstein publisher. Before saying a few words about the book itself, I would like to acknowledge that this event is an initiative of Dr. Rachel Freudenthal and is being organized in cooperation with the three Leo Baeck Institutes. And we are all very grateful for their commitment for preserving and promoting German Jewish history and culture and for making conversations and events such as this one possible. So tonight we celebrate a book that brings to light the lives of four remarkable women from the Mosse family. And while of course the Mosse name, and we will hear much more about that, is well known in the history of German Jewry, journalism, public life, etc., this book today shifts our attention to women whose achievements, resilience, and also contributions to various fields deserve far greater recognition. Through the stories of Emily, Martha, Dora, and Hilde Mosse, Elisabeth Wagner offers much more than a family history. She provides a fascinating window into the experiences of German Jewish women across generations, tracing lives shaped by professional ambition, intellectual curiosity, social engagement, persecution, exile, and survival. What makes this book particularly valuable is its ability to connect individual biographies with larger historical developments. And through these women's lives, we gain insight into the opportunities and challenges faced by Jewish women in Germany and beyond. And we are reminded of the many ways in which they helped shape the societies in which they lived. So this evening will give us the opportunity not only to celebrate an important new publication, but also to reflect on the importance of recovering and sharing stories that might otherwise remain overlooked. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this event and to introduce the speakers, which I will do in the order of their appearance. So we will start tonight with Dr. Skye Doney, who's the director of the George Mosse Program in History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, co-director of the Global Mosse Lecture Series, and he's also series editor for the George Mosse series in the history of European culture, sexuality, and ideas at the University of Wisconsin Press. He is the author of The Persistence of the Sacred German Catholic Pilgrimage, 1832 to 1937, co-editor with Darcy Burke on Contemporary Europe in the Historical Imagination, editor and translator of Eva Noack Mosse's Holocaust memoir, Last Days of Theresienstadt. With Donatello Armeni and Laura Siglioni, he co-edited the special issue of the Journal of Contemporary History, George Mosse, Nationalism, and the Crisis of Liberal Democracies from 2021. And he also edits the Mosse blog. So he will make a start, and then I will introduce the other very important speakers, including the author of the book. So please, Skye.
Okay, I don't know. I think that'll work. I think it'll work. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Sharon, for running the logistics, LBI, Jerusalem, London, New York, and especially Elisabeth for this wonderful book that we get to talk about today. The organizers asked me to speak a little bit about the background of some members of the Mosse family and to point to their philanthropic legacy. I'm going to take my cue from Elisabeth, who uses this concept that she calls scenarios throughout the book that can help create a Resonanzraum, or resonance spaces, to talk about diverging individual experiences and to wade through very different historical contexts. So all that follows are brief scenarios that are focused on three members of the family's founding generation. I do have a few photos. So here's Hilda and Amelia in Schenkendorf. So three founders, Albert, Rudolf, and Amelia Mosse. Amelia appears in the top left photo of the cover of Elizabeth's book, and she and Rudolf are the grandparents to Hilda, who's here, in the top right of the book, and they're the aunt and uncle to Martha, who's on the bottom right, and Dora on the bottom left. Albert Mosse, let's see, was Rudolph's older brother, and again, father of Martha and Dora, in the lower photos in the cover of Die Mosse-Frauen. He was born in 1846 in Greiz in Posen as the sixth of 14 total children. So here you can see 7 of the Mosse brothers. His father, Markus Mosse, was a district physician of modest means, and his mother was Ulrike Wolf, and you can see them here. Albert moved to Berlin to pursue a career. And while Rudolf moved into advertising and printing, Albert trained as a lawyer. He finished law school in 1868, and by 1885, he had become a Landrichter. This is the same year that the Meiji regime came to power in Japan and brought with them a plan for a new constitution, a plan to reorganize the government and to centralize national authority. So Albert Mosse, I'll leave this one here for a bit. His law mentor, Rudolf Kneist, invited him to give a lecture on Prussian law to representatives from the Japanese embassy as they embarked on this plan. And it went so well that within months, Albert arrived in Tokyo with his wife, Lena, and their daughters, Dora and Martha, to advise the Meiji regime on administrative reform. They lived in Japan for 4 years, where Dora and Martha's brothers, Walter and Hans, were born, and then they moved back to Königsberg in 1890, where Albert continued to practice law for the next 17 years. He received an honorary doctorate from the Universität Königsberg in 1903 and became an honorary professor the following year. His nephew, the historian Werner Mosse, noted that Albert rose as far as he could in the Prussian civil service and law profession as an unbaptized Jew. When he retired at 63, he returned to Berlin, where he was named an honorary citizen, an Ehrenbürger, in 1917, and when he died in 1930, the family received an official message from the Japanese embassy mourning his passing. In brief, Albert is just one of the accomplished Mosse siblings, and a reminder, he's the father of 2 of the key protagonists that we'll hear about from Elisabeth, Martha and Dora. Here's the Order of the Rising Sun that he was awarded for his work on behalf of the Meiji regime. And you can read some really fascinating correspondence if you're interested in his life in this collection, Fast wie mein eigen Vaterland. All right, I'd like to say a little bit more about Rudolf and Amelia. Rudolf was born in 1843, attended gymnasium or secondary education in Lisa, now called Lesno, a small town in the southwest of modern-day Poland. He was apprenticed to a bookseller in Posen in 1860, and then, like his older brother Albert, decided to move to Berlin. And when he arrived, he had less than 100 marks to his name. Rudolf got a job initially working with his older brother Salomon, who you saw in one of the previous slides, in textiles. And he moved on from there to become an assistant in charge of books in a general store. And then he started to get newspaper jobs, first at the Telegraph in Leipzig, and by the end of 1864, he'd become the advertising coordinator for a family-run newspaper, Die Gartenlaube. So here's Rudolf as a young man. And then he also worked at the Kladderadatsch. And here is Die Gartenlaube. Rudolf proved himself extremely skilled in coordinating advertising. Indeed, he was so successful that the owner of Die Gartenlaube offered him a partnership, and Rudolf was 23 years old. But he saw the potential in advertising, so he declined the offer and moved back to Berlin to establish the Zeitungsannonce Expedition Rudolf Mosse, which you can see sketched out here, through which he adopted a personal approach and began working with individual clients to show them the advantages of advertising goods and services. And so as his customer base expanded, presses began to see growing revenues from advertising. And this was so successful that by 1868, he started to open additional branches in other major German cities, first in Munich, and then in 1869 in Hamburg. By 1871, they were in Nuremberg, Vienna, Frankfurt am Main, Zurich, Stuttgart, Breslau, and before 1875, Leipzig, Köln, Dresden. Each office covered a discrete geographical area of Central Europe. The offices were highly decentralized, which allowed the individual directors to become experts in the local industries. In 1892, the Mosse Zeitungsannoncenexpedition celebrated its 25th anniversary, and they had experienced continuous growth from 20 employees when he started to 247 by 1892. And in 1874, the firm famously purchased the block of Jerusalemer Strasse in Berlin, where they set up headquarters. In 1871, while Rudolf was playing scat with his older brother Emil Cohn, another very interesting person in this orbit, and some associates, they jokingly discussed opening their own newspaper instead of helping newspapers sell advertisements. And they thought the most difficult part would not be the journalism or finding journalists, but coordinating advertising. So in 1872, Mosse purchased the Berliner Tageblatt, and he developed it into a serious political force, into the leading newspaper, what several commentators have called the New York Times of its day. The Tageblatt became the yardstick by which other German newspapers were measured, or so Thomas L. Gertzen has argued. Rudolf believed that Berlin was poised to become a major world city and that the existing newspapers were unprepared for the impending political and cultural changes they would encounter. So he wanted the Tageblatt to help teach Germans about their new global responsibilities and to help put Berlin on the same footing as London and Paris. When he bought the Tageblatt, it had 5,000 subscribers. He expanded that in less than 20 years to 50,000. And they gained a reputation as being a liberal voice on multiple occasions, including taking on Bismarck publicly. Here's their obituary for Bismarck. And this is an 1899 poster that was designed by Ephraim Moses Lillian to give you a sense of the Tageblatt's aesthetics. Until the end of his life, Rudolf Mosse insisted that he was a publicity expert, but in truth, he was acting as a very political figure. And this is something I hope that we can talk about as the members of the Mosse family as political figures. During the First World War, the Tageblatt openly opposed German annexations of new territories as a war aim. They were critical of unrestricted U-boat warfare, and they critiqued the bravado of stated German foreign policy. Theodor Wolff, another person we could talk about while he was editor, was several times forbidden from writing publicly for the paper, and every time the ban would be lifted, Wolff would be right back at his critiques of the German regime, clearly with Rudolph's blessing. Now, contemporaries described Rudolf as having penetrating eyes. His grandson Werner said he was of small stature, inclined to stoutness, and that he wore a thin white goatee. He liked to smoke cigars. He worked very long hours. He said he didn't like business deals that lacked specifics or solidity. In business, he was unsentimental and accurate. His employees in his vast publishing and advertising empire noted that he could show up anywhere at any of the offices at any time and ask people how things were progressing. He read his rival publishers closely and would demand to know what had gone wrong if another newspaper broke a story before them. He demanded clarity from his journalists. In one meeting, he told them, quote, "We know quite well that you learned people know everything a lot better than we ordinary mortals, but that isn't what matters at all. Look," and with these words, he would get up from his desk and walk over to the window. "Look at the man down there, the man just going into that shop to buy his half-pound of coffee. It is for him that our paper is written. It should be clear, factual, and informative. I want to learn something from my paper. I don't want a mass of empty phrases or learned stuffiness." I like to think that his grandson, George Mosse, inherited this opinion, and that's why we can continue to learn so much from his research. It is clear, factual, and informative, while still remaining provocative and learned. And perhaps Rudolph's admonishment to reject the empty phrases that were popular was the precursor to George Mosse telling his students in the 1960s that they had to rid themselves of their slogans if they wanted to understand the past. Okay, by 1905, Rudolf and Amelia Mosse's fortune stood at over 34 million marks. In Berlin, their net worth was only surpassed by two individuals, Fritz von Friedlander-Vogt, an entrepreneur, and Ernest von Mendelssohn-Bartholdy, a banker and a descendant of Moses Mendelssohn. Rudolf, Amelia, and Albert Mosse were part of a new generation of German Jews who could make use of new social and economic opportunities. They could find a place of prominence in unified Germany. This generation enjoyed almost complete civil and economic equality. Rudolf, for his part, believed in German social values and in German culture. He thumbed his nose at the old aristocracy, and he fought for a democratic and a liberal future. As one example, he refused an offer for a title of nobility to become von Mosse because he thought that this was just a way for the older German elites to feudalize the quickly rising German bourgeoisie. Recall that the two individuals who are wealthier than Rudolf were both ennobled Pons. All right. That's a bit on Rudolf. His personality, his public life, and his work in printing and advertising. He advanced his own vision for a liberal and a just society through his art, through his donations, and through his acquisitions, and through very generous workplace policies. These furthered his belief in a Macht des Wissens, or the power of knowledge, an ideology that was deeply shared by his wife, Amelia. Indeed, Amelia took the lead in most of the couple's philanthropy. So how did they deploy these resources, the 34 million Reichsmarks in 1905? On his 70th anniversary in 1913, Rudolf gave away over 1.58 million marks to 21 different organizations, including 1 million marks to the city of Berlin, 300,000 to benefit the employees of his firm, and 100,000 to the Rudolf Virchow Hospital. His birthday gift also benefited the Berlin unhoused, individuals who were newly released from prison, impoverished book printers in Leipzig, Berlin artists, a reform school for Jewish girls, etc. And here again, Rudolf and Amelia adopted an ecumenical approach, funding initiatives that improved the quality of life of diverse groups in Berlin and in Germany. When miners went on strike in January 1905 in the far west of Germany in the Ruhrgebiet, Rudolf and Amelia donated 10,000 marks to offset the lost wages so the miners could continue to feed their families and to ensure that their children did not suffer during the strike. As one historian has noted, whoever in Berlin, and not even just there, applied for financial support with a sound social cause, they could turn to Rudolf or Amelia Mosse with a great chance of success. Okay, Amelia Mosse, I promise this is only about 15 minutes, and then we'll get to hear the main event, Elisabeth. Amelia Mosse came from Western Germany in Trier, the hometown of Karl Marx. She grew up comfortably. Her father was a retailer. In 1884, with Rudolf, she opened a shelter for young women, the Verein Mädchenhort, that was tasked with preventing social and moral decline of young girls who did not have a network of support. The Mädchenhort provided stability to girls who did not have a father or whose mothers were full-time employed. It gave them a place to go after school and during the summer holiday. Amelia next founded the Amelia and Rudolf Mosse Stiftung in the Berlin-Wilmersdorf neighborhood in 1893. This took 2 years to build, over 600,000 marks for the facility. It was expensive in part because the Mosses had to update the sewage lines, pave roads, etc. The building was centered on a 6-acre plot that was surrounded by gardens, playgrounds, a gymnasium, and above the entrance they inscribed the Amelia and Rudolf Mosse Stift, dedicated to the youth. The Mosse Stift was set up as an institution in which the children of impoverished families would find a secure shelter and enjoy an education which is simple but sufficient to meet the requirements of a bourgeois life. Here's Amelia with some of the students. They visited regularly, but Amelia traveled to the Mosse Stift every Monday during lunch. She chatted with the children. And one alum, Hilda Anke, recalled that during one of these visits, in which Amelia asked her, "What is for lunch today?" And she answered with caterpillars because she had just been playing in the garden. Amelia joked, a nutritious meal, playing on nahrhaft and nahrhaft, so nutritious and foolish. And she was kidding with Hilda. Before Elisabeth's book, we didn't have a lot of sources on Amelia's personality, but I think this is sort of a telling moment. Emilia was honored by the Hohenzollern monarchy. She received the Wilhelmsorden for her enormous social and charitable engagement. In short, the founding generation, Albert, Rudolf, Emilia, the other Mosse siblings, as Elisabeth has called them, were generous and creative. They worked to address different forms of inequality. George L. Mosse, Rudolf and Emilia's grandson, was asked in Berlin in the 1980s why his grandparents believed in philanthropy and why they would work for the common good. And he responded, quote, "Yes, this is a good question. It was especially important for the Jews towards achieving integration, and it was part of their liberalism, the legacy of the Enlightenment that they sought to uphold. Philanthropy was a part of Jewish tradition." What should I say? Traditionally, to be German, Jewish, and liberal meant supporting tolerance, individual freedom, economic freedom, freedom of the press, freedom of thought. That's what it was all about. And he continued, this is an essential aspect, their belief in tolerance, in education, in individual freedoms. In his business, Rudolf worked to give his employees all they needed to thrive, a fair wage, benefits, and the assurance that their loved ones could be cared for if anything were to go wrong. The spirit of the Mosse house has continued. So here you can see the Mosse Stift today in the Wilmersdorf neighborhood. You can even grab a coffee at the Emilia and Rudolf Mosse Familien Cafe. The spirit of the Mosse house has continued, and the work continued in the next generations in the work of Dora Panofsky, Hilda Mosse, and others that we'll hear about today. And in the writings and lectures of George L. Mosse. Here you can see Emilia looking rather skeptical with Gerhard George behind the wheel of a car in Schenkendorf. At the Mosse program and at the Mosse lectures, we strive to further the important work of the family. The Mosse program has supported the research of over 170 professors, graduate students, and undergraduates. And in the spirit of Albert, Rudolf, and Emilia, our alumni, we like to think of them as a new generation that can continue the conversation and continue to improve public discourse. I encourage you to visit the program website and the Mosse Lectures website to learn more about our events. We have talks every year in New York, Berlin, Vienna, Rome, Berkeley, Tokyo, and beyond. And the spirit of the Mosse Lectures is firmly rooted in the family tradition. The talks aim to popularize new and creative approaches to the most pressing problems of our time. So thank you for having me today. And thank you for letting me give this sketch. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sky, for this wonderful first talk. And I will now come to Elisabeth. So Dr. Elisabeth Wagner, the author of the book that we're talking about today, is an art historian and literary scholar at the Humboldt University in Berlin. She holds a doctorate on Kunstszenarien in Unternehmen, art scenarios in companies, from 1999, and she is was responsible for the program and coordination of the graduate colleague, The Coding of Violence in Media Transformation. She is the co-founder of the Mosse Lecture series, editor of and contributor to numerous publications, Europa im Blick der anderen, Konversionen, Mosse Almanach, Non Finito, and has written numerous essays and articles on Anselm Kiefer, James Turrell, Ingeborg Bachmann, Hans Magnus Enzensberger, and Peter Weiss, among others. And yeah, it is now my pleasure to hand over to Elisabeth as the author of the book, and we are looking forward to hearing more from her.
Elisabeth, you're muted.
Okay.
Good.
Now you can hear me. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Svenja, for this kind introduction. I know it's not exactly easy to introduce me since my professional career and background is rather unconventional. Sky has provided as a broader context of the Mosse family. I will talk now about the Mosse women under the title Life at the Limit of Conventions. Picture 1, please. Who are the Mosse women? Why are they interesting? My book covers 4 of them, key figures in tune with the habits of this prominent bourgeois Jewish family, living in the span from Imperial Germany, First World War, and the Weimar Republic, all the way to the post-war period. Their lives being uprooted and shaken by Nazi Germany, the Second World War, and exile. These 4 women stepped out of the private sphere of the family and found their way into the public realm. How to write a biography, even a collective biography. Approaching these women as a literary scholar and art historian, I share the argument of Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, about the pitfalls of the biographical illusion. This means to propagate rounded and holistic lives following the ever-developing unified identities of biographical characters, narratives that aim for wholeness and closure from cradle to grave. Feminist research, too, has challenged such a biographical stagings of famous lives. What makes the lives of these bourgeois women so appealing is their very placement and displacement within the social spaces they had to inhabit. Concentrating on pivotal points in their lives, exploring their peculiarities and obstinacies, my book shows the unconventionally conventional. With their unique characters and activities, these 4 bourgeois women created opportunities for themselves beyond their families, but within the very limits of habitual patterns of their backgrounds. These female biographies become real in their fragmentation. There is no biographical master discourse. The available textual and visual sources point to the blind spots of these lives. In my search for these largely undocumented female lives, I had to draw on traditional material like letters, diaries, photographs, but I also had to recognize more unexpected traces. For example, picture 2 now, a hat. I got hold of one of Dora Mosse-Panofsky's knitting works. In her Princeton evenings, Dora was tirelessly knitting such hats and also blankets for university friends and colleagues. Albert Einstein, who was seen on campus wearing such a hat, observed Dora's knitting and was fascinated by this revealing work in progress. This drew my attention to Dora's, the art historian's, distinct means of expression. Thus, her knitting requires a special chapter in my book. Today, I will focus mainly on the biographies of Martha and Dora Mosse. I will highlight a few moments, certain scenarios in their lives. Moments when the available textual and visual evidence accumulates around a particular experience. Such moments provide an approximate idea of past presentness. About Emilie and Hilde, the other two Mosse women, I treat in my book only a few impressions. Skye told us about Emilie and Rudolf Mosse, their philanthropic engagement, so I just will underline that Emilie in my book is a founding figure of one of the Mosse's main achievements, the tradition of charity that is linked to the Jewish tradition of tzedakah. And it also represented the cultural prestige of the Mosse publishing house in Berlin. Picture 3 now. One of the highlights in Emilie's life and special event for the Jewish community was the award of the Imperial Wilhelm's Medal in 1909, the first to a Jewish woman that allowed her access to the court, an honor that was promptly denounced in contemporary anti-Semitic publications. Less known is the fact that Emilie, unconventionally conventional, was well acquainted with leaders of the emerging bourgeois women's movement, like Gertrud Bäumer, Helene Stöcker, and Alice Salomon, whom she helped to realize their projects. Emilie was also co-founder of the Lyceum Club, Berlin, supported female artists and younger writers to get their articles published in the Berliner Tageblatt. In 1912, she was strongly engaged in the organization of the exhibition Die Frau in Haus und Beruf, the woman in household and profession, together with her friend Anna Plato. It was hailed as a groundbreaking event in the papers of the Mosse Verlag and as a landmark in the world of women, even in the conservative Vossische Zeitung. Picture 4 now. Hilde Mosse, born in 1912, shared her grandmother Emilie's strong commitment to social work. Against all family conventions, she became engaged with the socialist youth organization Die Flugscharen and also the Jüdische Reformgemeinde. Exiled in 1933, Hilde suffered most from the loss of her Vaterland, as she wrote in her diary. In 1938, after a Swiss doctorate in medicine, she was the first of her family who managed to flee to the USA. Here, she specialized in social psychiatry. The impact of her research and her publications would later reach far beyond the academy. In 1946, together with Frederick Wertham, she founded the Lafar Clinic, which offered mental care to the Black population of Harlem. Both Mosse and Wertham became appointed experts in court cases of racial discrimination. Based on their Harlem experiences, they provided evidence that segregation in schools places children at severe disadvantages and causes mental health problems. Hilde's social psychiatric work informed the famous 1951 Wilmington, Delaware judgment, which became pivotal for the Supreme Court's path-breaking ruling on segregation in schools in 1954. Much aware of anti-Semitism in New York and New Jersey, Hildes Mosse's empathetic support of anti-racist protests was by no means incidental. In 1962, as a visiting Fulbright professor at Marburg University, she was shocked to learn that the inviting professor was involved in eugenic research for the Nazis. Let me turn now to Martha and Dora Mosse. Speaking of the development and achievements in the German bourgeois middle class in the 19th century in general, and Jewish bourgeoisification in particular, the catchphrase Besitz, what means property, and Bildung is most significant. For the family of Albert and Lina Mosse, the parents of Martha and Dora, Bildung was held in highest esteem. The two sisters were brought up with a focus on intellectual challenges, literature, philosophy, art, and music. Martha was first engaged in vocal studies. Dora first studied archaeology and later art history. Martha and Dora, born in 1884 and 1885, grew up in Japan and Königsberg. Their father had been denied a suitable position in the Prussian capital because he refused to convert. When the family returned to Berlin in 1907, after 5 years in Japan and 15 years in Königsberg, the sisters were in their early 20s, conventionally a marriageable age. I'll move on to Martha. Picture 5, please.
Next picture, please.
Next picture, please. Since 1910, Martha Mosse committed herself to social work with children who needed care and aid. She was in contact and cooperated with important protagonists of the women's movement like Anna Papritz and Frieda Dünsing. She studied law in Heidelberg, received her doctorate with her study Der Erziehungsanspruch des Kindes, Children's Rights to Education, that became influential on the legislation of youth welfare in the early Weimar Republic. As a legal specialist, she was employed in Berlin's police headquarters, becoming the first female police counselor in Prussia. In 1933, the Nazis expelled her from the job. Unlike the other Mosses, Martha remained in Germany, not least because her love relationship with Anna Stock, her lifelong partner. And this leads to another scenario, the dramatic dilemma Martha had to go through. Since 1934, she was employed by the Jüdische Gemeinde, where she eventually came to be responsible for the forced relocation of Berlin Jews into Jewish housing. Since 1941, under Gestapo command in preparation of the deportations. The most dangerous occupation in this situation, as Leo Baeck later testified. This work led to the allegations confronting her in the post-war period that her collaboration under distress helped the Gestapo deport Jews to the camps. On June 16, 1943, Martha herself was deported to Theresienstadt. Living there next door to Leo Baeck, she became involved in the Jewish self-administration due to her experience in legal matters and administrative tasks. She was put into the position of a judge to sentence minor offenses and was later recruited to work in the so-called Central Evidence Office. Being overwhelmed by the situation in Theresienstadt after its liberation and by the arrival of 1,000 other refugees, Martha tried desperately to preserve a minimum of dignity and self-control. In her later reports, she claimed that she did what she could do due to her strong sense of human responsibility. And she kept, as we learned from her letters and reports, her self-control under this extreme pressure. Soon after her return to Berlin in July 1945, Martha was approached in the street by a Jewish woman with these words. I quote from Martha's report archived in the Wiener Library in London. As you know, people take badly that you are still alive. I advise you not to take a better position, otherwise one will take action against you. And this was not an empty threat. Due to complaints from within the Jewish community, Martha had to resign from her recently acquired position as justice counselor for the Americans in preparation for the Nuremberg trials. Despite the support of her American boss, Ossip Flechtheim, she was deemed unemployable. In order to put a stop to the slander against her, to stop it at the source, as she wrote in her report, she requested an Ehrengericht, court of honor, against herself in August 1947. She produced evidence with 21 testimonies on her behalf, preserved in the Leo Baeck Institute, New York, among them a testimony by Leo Baeck. Employed by the Jüdische Gemeinde, Baeck wrote, she had to deal with the demands of the National Socialist authorities. In this extremely difficult task, Ms. Mosse has shown the best qualities of character, objectivity, and readiness to help. She was always forced to inform people about hardships and pains, but everyone who was able to watch the painful task given to Ms. Mosse can testify that she has done her duty in a righteous and clean manner. And Baeck continues referring to the canon of values in the Old Testament. During the whole time, I have known Ms. Mosse as a woman of strong, indisputable righteousness. Finally, on May 6, 1948, Martha could write to Henry Scarf, another former officer of the military government in Berlin, that she had been cleared after all. Reading the many archived statements in the Wiener Library and elsewhere, which demonstrated what Leo Baeck had called her righteousness, one can imagine how terrible Martha must have suffered from these accusations and defamations confronting her for her years. Martha's personality, the lesbian, the woman, the bourgeois Prussian invited, obviously, people to view her as a scapegoat. It seems that eventually she found a kind of Heimat in the Berliner Frauenbund, where she had close friends and was engaged in work in behalf of the political and legal emancipation of women in West Germany. I now turn to Dora Mosse, the younger of the two sisters. Picture 6, please. In her studies of archaeology first and art history at the Friedrich Wilhelms University in Berlin, Dora came across Erwin Panofsky at an early age, already successful art historian. In April 1916, in the middle of war, they married in Berlin in the new synagogue Oranienburger Straße. In 1917 and 1919, Dora gave birth to her two sons. In 1920, the family moved to Hamburg, where Dora's husband was to become professor at the university. This sounds as if at least one of the Mosse women followed the expected pattern of bourgeois conduct. Dora did, but in her own way. She made clear from the beginning that family life with motherhood and childcare was not her all and everything. With Bertha Ziegenhagen, she had a dedicated housekeeper to give her free time to pursue her own interests and work in the Warburg Institute. She was quite aware of her outward appearance, dressing in the androgynous style inspired by those new women in the Weimar Republic, short hair, necktie and flat cap, a look she kept for the whole life, a habit showing somehow her feeling of being different. All this should change nonetheless with a terrible disruption in her life when the Nazis came to power in 1933 and her husband was expelled from his university position. Dora's whole being, her life and her work, were at stake when the family arrived in Princeton in September 1934. Her hopes and ambition had suffered a devastating blow, while Erwin, with his fame as a scholar and experienced in procedural matters, was honored with a professorate at the prestigious Institute for Advanced Study. Dora felt isolated, fragile in health, longing for who she was and what she had in her Hamburg existence. Forlorn, but not lost. Friends and colleagues have kept in good memory how Dora made efforts to preserve stubbornly at times herself and her studies in the new, as she felt it, unsettled surrounding. She resisted strongly to conform to the demanding habits of the Princeton professors' wives. Instead, she cultivated her own style. In her own family, she was addressed as our Jakob, alluding to a certain gender ambiguity. The first thing to do was, as before in Hamburg, to hire a housekeeper to maintain her distance from housework and family matters. Emma Epps, active in the civil rights movement, stayed with the Panofskys until the end of their life. This meant Dora could reactivate and intensify her research in art history. She produced several innovative articles well remembered in our days, thereby seeking and finding her very own means of expression. William Hatcher, the good friend of both Panofskys, had a special interest in collecting characteristic biographies of scholars and artists who experienced their professional and creative breakthrough in their later years. Their exceptional egogenesis, as he called it. And William Hatcher reserved a place of honor in this gallery for Dora Panofsky, who was already 58 when she published for the first time. Her husband, praising her productivity, remarked with irony and appreciation, incidentally, Dora again has, at her age, fertile like Sarah, written an essay on Watteau. To conclude, I'd like to highlight Dora Mosse's particular means of expression, her very ways to give gestalt to her life that encompass her whole being. She had a passion to discover so-called pathos formulas, special moments of excitation and passion. Such moments have been permanently transformed in European cultural history from antiquity to the present. Postures, gestures, specific energetic incidents to be articulated in a visual language. Let pictures do the talking, as William Hatcher said. Her investigations were based on Erwin Panofsky's iconological concept, but unlike his symbolic and overall conclusions, Dora insisted instead on the vividness, the visual evidence of the phenomena observed. Dora's scholarly publications since the 1940s provide insight in these personal sensitivities. Let's look at an example. Picture 7 now, please. To show you the one historical work of art, an icon of European modernity that was most meaningful for Dora. Antoine Watteau's portrait of the figure of Gilles of 1718. Dora, with her acute observation, noticed how unimpressive this figure looks. Gilles, standing there, draped in his colorless, shoddy costume, facial expression and gestures, somehow reduced, his arms hanging down, held close to the body, a picture of being vulnerable and exposed. The lonely Gilles is pushed to the foreground, forced to act on the proscenium, the front stage. And this mise en scène indicates that Gilles, in the tradition of the Pierrot, is a born player, a comedian, inward tragic and outward clownish, a pathetic expression of excitement and despair, as Dora put it. And she quotes a line by William Wordsworth, meaningful for Gilles and for Dora herself. There is a luxury in self-dispraise. Evidently, Dora's Gilles as a speaking image is both. highly self-identificatory and highly self-reflective. In this respect, Colin Eisler, the colleague and friend in Dora Mosse's social circle at Princeton, draws a most telling picture of her. I quote, "Her wise innocence contributed to a person and personality of unique grace, ineffable charm and kindness. Her shimmering wit, sometimes recalling that of a celestial enfant terrible, was very like that of Watteau, whose art she wrote of so tellingly." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. And we are now moving to Natalie Neimark-Goldberg's comment, and I will briefly introduce her. So Dr. Natalie Neimark-Goldberg is a historian specializing in the history of Jewish women in Germany from the 18th to the early 20th century and the study of the Haskalah. She is the author of Jewish Women in Berlin, an Enlightenment Culture, and editor of Bertha Pappenheim, a woman's writings on feminism and Judaism. She's currently, for the Leo Baeck Institute Jerusalem, editing an anthology of texts by German Jewish women intellectuals in Hebrew translation, and is also writing a biography of feminist activist Hannah Kaminsky. So, Natalie, please, the floor is yours. And thank you, Elisabeth, again. Wonderful.
Thank you, Svenja, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. First of all, I would like to thank Rachel Freudenthal and Sharon Livne from the Leo Baeck Institute, Jerusalem, for this invitation. And I also want to congratulate Elisabeth Wagner on her wonderful book. Reading it has been a rewarding and a pleasant experience, and I have learned a great deal from it. The Mosses, as is widely known in German Jewish history, and as we have sufficiently heard, were a prominent and influential family. They boasted celebrated figures in the publishing business and in the academic field, first in Germany and later, following forced migration, in the United States. However, as is often the case, the historical lens has focused almost exclusively on the men of the dynasty until now. Elisabeth Wagner's book, Die Mosse Frau and the Mosse Women, German Jewish Life Stories, steps in to reframe the narrative. Wagner turns her attention away from the men of the family, although we also hear about them, and focuses on family members who have been much less researched, even though they were also influential in their own time. Specifically, she uncovers the stories of the accomplished women from this family who were either born into the Mosse lineage or became Mosse by marriage. By doing this, Wagner explicitly corrects the male-centered perspective that has long prevailed in historical research. And she does so in an interesting way, bringing together outstanding figures from different periods who lived through what turned out to be the most turbulent decades in the history of German Jewry. If we look closer at the scale of this project, the scope of Wagner's study is remarkable, both in terms of its historical timeframe and its geographic range. The narrative leads us from the midst of the German Empire through the trauma of World War I and into the fragile democracy of the Weimar Republic. From there, it moves into the Nazi era and World War II, before finally reaching the complex landscape of the post-war era, not just in Germany, but also beyond. As the historical forces of persecution unfold, the narrative eventually moves out of Europe and ends in the United States. Here we have an innovative approach. When we think about biographies, they usually focus either on one single person or they look at a specific generation or group, such as the members of a social movement or an intellectual circle. But this book does something different. It presents a collective portrait of 4 women who were not contemporaneous, but belonged to 3 different generations. In this and in other ways, as we already heard from Wagner, she challenges the very idea of writing a biography. While these key figures, as Wagner calls them, were significantly different from one another, with each woman following her own unique path depending on her natural inclination and the historical reality she encountered, they also shared things in common, not just their last name, but also certain traits and similar habitus. As upper middle class German Jewish women, they were accustomed to wealth. Yet, none of them fit the stereotype of the traditional bourgeois woman. Exhibiting remarkable initiative and resourcefulness, they managed to find their way out of restrictive female roles, and all ended up being extremely active in the public sphere. Indeed, every single one of them sought an existence that went far beyond domestic duties and social obligations. And what is crucial, they all hoped to find meaning in life that was not necessarily dependent on a male figure. This impulse to break away from traditional family roles, to reject domestic confinement, and to forge an independent path becomes vivid when we look closely at the specific case studies. The first generation is represented by Emily Lowenstein, born in Bochum in 1851. She grew up in a wealthy Jewish home and joined the Mosse family when she married Rudolf Mosse, the influential publisher. But instead of settling into the life of a typical bourgeois housewife, who at most would join a women's beneficent society, Emily soon engaged in a serious, active volunteer work outside her home. And the fact that she was childless surely played a role. She became a leading philanthropist in her own right and was deeply involved in the thriving women's movement, and we already heard about this. Even though she didn't leave behind any writings of her own, and she's the only one of the 4 women who has no interest in the bibliography of the book, I think, she actively intervened in the printing business by encouraging the inclusion of women's issues and female authors in her husband's publishing concern. In the second generation, we encountered the 2 sisters, Martha and Dora. Martha was born in 1884. An important biographical detail is that she never married. By refraining from marriage and living as a lesbian, as we already heard, she clearly deviated from what was considered the expected path for women of the middle class during that era. Following in her father's footsteps, she earned a law degree, and by the 1920s, she was working for the Prussian police, eventually becoming its first female consul. After being expelled from public office as a Jew with the Nazi rise to power, she started working for the Jewish community. Having survived the war in Theresienstadt, she was able to resume her professional life in West Germany. After clearing her name concerning her activities during the war, she rejoined the police service as a legal clerk. Unlike Martha, her sister Dora did marry, but you already heard she was far from becoming a typical housewife. Dora had 2 sons, unlike her aunt Emily, who was also married but childless. Yet having a family didn't stop her from pursuing a career. She forged her own path outside the home, gradually building a name for herself as an art historian, first in Germany and later at Princeton. We finally meet Hilde Mosse, born some 4 decades after Martha and Dora in 1912. Like Martha, Hilde never married and was also able to build a successful career. She actually grew up in Berlin, surrounded by immense wealth as the granddaughter of Rudolf Mosse. But after being forced to escape Nazi Germany, she made it to the United States in the late 1930s. In New York, she made a career as a psychiatrist working with children from the lower classes, notably within the Black community, and remained professionally active until late in life before passing away in 1982. If we go back to the issue of the expanded time frame of the book, we see that one of the advantages of this approach is that it enables a diachronic examination of central themes that come up when discussing the lives of these women, topics that run through the narrative from the beginning to the end. One thing that may be examined in this way is anti-Semitism. We may track how anti-Semitism was reflected differently in the lives of these women, how it changed over time, and what its implications were in the different historical periods. Another theme we're able to follow diachronically, thanks to the book's scope, and on which I will dwell a little longer, concerns the history of the women's movement, and more specifically, the development of women's emancipation and their growing participation in professional life. The fact that Wagner's study covers such a lengthy time frame makes it possible to compare the lives of women from a similar background in different generations and to observe the transformations that took place across a relatively long period of time. It enables us to track some of the processes that emancipating women went through since the last decades of the 19th century until well into the 20th century. If we look at Emily, by modern standards, we might not instantly label her a real feminist. She didn't gain a higher education, she didn't have a formal career, and many aspects of her life seem quite traditional. But nevertheless, she was groundbreaking, and like many contemporary women, she brought about change without outwardly transgressing the gender rules of her time. She used her position as the wife of a powerful businessman to dive deeply into public life, particularly promoting women's goals. I especially enjoyed learning about her involvement in the 1912 historical exhibition, the Frauenhaus in Beruf, which we have already heard about. This was really a memorable event, as even later sources indicate, and it attracted a great public interest. This exhibition sought to showcase women's often unacknowledged achievements and participation in multiple fields, such as literature, the arts, education, social policy, sciences, medicine, the crafts, and the civil service. This exhibition does serve to empower women, offering them new perspectives on how to lead their lives. As Wagner shows, Emily didn't just participate in organizing this exhibition, she was one of its core initiators. She mobilized resources, co-headed the press section, and likely oversaw the printing of its catalog in the Mosse Verlag. We saw a picture of the catalog before. Emily thus left a legacy as an incredibly active force who helped pave the way for future generations, although she herself could not fulfill professional aspirations, whether she had them or not. When we turn to Martha and her sister Dora, who, as we heard, both succeeded in their respective careers, we learn how hesitant and protracted the beginnings of their professional life actually were. It took a long time for them to decide, or perhaps dare, to attend university at a relatively late age. And only then did they begin to develop their careers. First, they had to overcome both social and personal norms and expectations. In their childhood, they did receive a good education, but no one had anticipated them seeking higher studies. It is telling that Martha, in her late 20s, was still looking for a professional path, and it was only in her late 30s, if I'm not wrong, that she obtained her academic title. While in the first generation, Emily pursued no studies or professional training, and in the second one, Dora and Martha did so at a relatively late age, Hilde, who belonged to the third generation, approached her university studies and career in a more natural way, as did those around her. She was able to enroll at Bonn University before she turned 20, although due to the political circumstances, she soon moved to Switzerland, where she continued her studies and became a medical doctor. As we heard, she then practiced as a psychiatrist for the rest of her life. Putting these stories all together thus highlights aspects that might otherwise go unnoticed. It shows how bourgeois, upper middle class German Jewish women used the expanding boundaries of female emancipation across 3 consecutive generations against the backdrop of German Jewry's most transformative era. Of course, not all German Jewish women of their generations enjoyed the status and the economic comfort of these Mosse women, which largely enabled them to pursue such lives. Yet their story still illuminates the impulse for female emancipation, professional recognition, and personal autonomy that many other bourgeois women actively lived and fought for. Refusing to be passive bystanders, they utilized new educational opportunities to secure degrees and claim a space in public life. To conclude, I will say that the book is simply engaging. We not only learn about the lives of the main protagonists, but we are also we're also drawn into the broader family dynamic surrounding these four women. To this, I would add Wagner's use of a particular type of source that is not very common in historical research, and I mean visual materials. Pictures and images serve here not just as illustrations, as many of us do in our books, but enable Wagner to draw a crucial historical information. It's fascinating, for instance, to follow her analysis of the large painting that hung in Emily Mosse's home, or the picture taken in Japan of Martha and Dora, along with their mother, siblings, and nannies. So thank you, Elisabeth, and thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Natalie. For this, again, a very rich talk, and I think all taken together, we have really learned a lot, and the contextualization was very, interesting, helpful. And to the audience, thank you, for still being with us. And Elisabeth has kindly agreed to take some questions, if there are any questions from the audience. And I'm sure Natalie and Skye would do the same, but of course Elisabeth is at the center here, so if there are any questions for her on her book, please feel free to ask. So I will read one question that came in through the chat for Elisabeth. So why did Gerhard George Lachmann adopt his wife's last name of Mosse?
I think that's a question of Skye. Skye can give a better answer, but Lachmann Mosse, he married the adopted daughter of Emilia, and she was Felicia Mosse. She was not the child of Emilia, but the father was Rudolf Mosse. And Felicia married Hans Lachmann, and he, because he wanted to be the boss in the Mosse Verlag, he adopted the name Mosse, therefore Lachmann Mosse. I hope that's right, Skye.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then there's Felicia and Hans' son, George Gerhard, always used both. So it's George L. Mosse, Lachmann Mosse.
Yes, he was his son.
Thank you. So there's still the opportunity if anyone has further questions. If not, I may ask one if I'm allowed. I was really fascinated by how many, by the richness of the book and how you structured the material, given that there are several biographies you're looking at. Maybe you could say a little bit more. We have already heard about like visual materials. You have also shown the hat and the knitting, how the material guided you in structuring your book. You're still muted. I think you're still on mute, Elisabeth.
Okay, thank you. Yes, of course, first of all, the material had to be founded. And as I told Of course, I had to deal with only fragments. For my biographical writing, I was confronted with a problem of telling whole life stories out of the partial, you could say, parts of that story, fragments, the whole life under the condition of fragmentation, the individual life and the facts of social life. Something like the identity is not given. The being is what I had to learn, ambiguous in itself. The consequences for biographical writing to identify the crucial points in the material, even in knitting work, of course, also paintings, photographs, and so on. And if you can deal with it, you can accentuate the special events most important for these lives. So my biographical writing was stationary, meaningful in a so-called kind of a thick description, which we know from Malinowski. And so I combined it to certain scenarios meaningful for the whole life. So I hope that will be an answer for you.
Yes, thank you. And we have another question. Maybe, yeah, let's take this one as the last one. Charlotte Lenger asked in the chat. Oh, there's another one coming in now. So thank you so much for this interesting lecture. Did you come upon any literary texts written by the presented women?
I didn't find any text.
Literary texts.
Yes.
By the women. Did you find anything?
Yes, there, of course, there was this famous novel, Die Effingers, from Tergit, Gabriele Tergit. This novel shows a lot of scenery, how we can imagine when the Mosses met. They had their meetings usually on Sundays, and then the whole family came. And Tergit, who was somehow connected with the Mosse family, she was a journalist, who wrote also in the Berliner Tageblatt, and I think she must have been there. She can describe it very close. And we also have other literary texts where Martha Mosse is described in a very yes, with all her discipline and her very, yes, how could I say, I think it was clear how self-disciplined and more this Prussian manner, what was specific for Martha Mosse.
Thank you. And someone wrote here, my father's great-grandfather was Leopold Ullstein. Leopold's youngest son, Hermann Ullstein, married Margarete Littauer, whose mother was Therese Mosse. Did you come across any information about the Ullstein women and culture in the course of your research? One of Leopold's granddaughters was Annie Albers.
Yes, not so close. I know that there were contacts between the Ullsteins and the Mosses. Martha mentioned in one of her reports that she was talking to one of this family, but I didn't find closer relations.
Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, I would say unless there are any urgent additional questions or comments from the speakers, it remains to really thank the speakers. First of all, of course, Elisabeth for her presentation and for sharing this book with us. Thanks to Sky and to Natalie for your talks. And yeah, thank you in the name of the Leo Baeck Institute to all those who joined us tonight, who stayed with us. Yeah, we learned all a lot and it has been fascinating. Thank you.